Welcome, Mark Devlin. For those who don't know, Mark is a DJ, he is a music journalist, and he is a researcher. He has a really good understanding of the music industry and their corrupt business, and he is here to talk about it. Welcome, Mark Devlin.
Hey, Sid, good to be with you.
Thank you. Good to be with you. Thank you for your time. So would you like to introduce yourself for those who do not know?
Sure. Well, before whatever it is I'm doing now, however you describe that, I was a club and radio DJ for many years, also a music journalist. And I really enjoyed my time doing all of that because I was blissfully unaware of all the stuff that I know now. So I got gigs up and down the UK. I was fortunate enough to travel internationally. And I was flitting around doing this every weekend for many years. And things got to around about 2007, 2008. And in those times, I was starting to question, first of all, the nature of the music that I was playing, which was R&B, hip hop, reggae, what was termed urban music. By that point, this music was really starting to go down the toilet in terms of the degradation of the lyrics and also the production techniques, the way the records sounded. I didn't like the way it was all going. And this sparked a period of research where I started looking into the big questions in life, such as who's really controlling these different aspects of society, not just entertainment and music, but the world of politics and big business and health and medicine and religion and everything else. And so I started researching all this stuff, and it really changed my entire perspective on the world and life and what it is that I was doing. And so I pretty much turned my back on the music at that point and really started to wind down the DJing. I don't do much of that anymore. I play the odd gig at festivals and such, preferably daytime or early evening, because I'm just not built for late nights anymore after about 20 years of doing that. But since 2010, I've been full-time researching the true nature of the music industry, how that fits into the bigger picture of what's going on in organized society. And so I've been putting out my books and doing podcasts and videos and live talks all that time. And now it's become my full-time job.
So you gave a speech at Kings Lynn the other week, last Saturday, I think it was. Would you like to talk, just put it into a nutshell for the viewers?
Sure. Well, in that talk, I presented 3 household name A-list acts as examples of how those that control the music industry use their key assets to further certain agendas. And I kind of made the point that these assets are more stooges of the system doing its bidding and pushing its agendas first and foremost than they are artists. The fact that they're musicians almost becomes secondary when you look at how they've been used to push messages through the decades. So the examples I gave were in part 1, the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, the 2 biggest groups of the 1960s, and arguably the 2 biggest music groups of all time. And so these 2 were put out there as rivals. They were pitched as being against each other. But the truth is, they were not only friends, they hung out together socially. I also believe or suspect that they were products of the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, which is one of these social engineering think tanks that specializes in shaping and molding culture and sowing values and belief systems in the minds of the general public. So there's clear evidence that the Beatles and the Stones were both used for this during the 60s, particularly in the second half of the 1960s, which is where so much social change was occurring. So you had new attitudes towards sex and marriage and social justice causes, civil rights, and all this kind of thing, changing attitudes towards drugs. LSD was everywhere, other kinds of psychedelics. And those 2 groups were used very much to push all of that in that desired direction. And then in the second part of the talk, I presented Prince, who is an artist whose music I've always enjoyed. But I presented evidence for Prince being a walking contradiction because there was such duality between different sides of his personality as well as in his music. So he's best remembered for his very lewd, lascivious, sexually explicit output. But he also had a great number of songs that were pushing great spiritual, metaphysical, religious kind of truths. And he clearly knew a thing or two about all of this. And this was also reflected in his personality. So I think he was probably mind controlled, as so many of these artists are. They're subject to trauma-based mind control. And it creates these different personalities, these different alter egos within them. And we often see this getting expressed through their artistry and through interviews and comments that they make off the record. And so Prince made a few of these. He made a few statements to make us think that he's on our side, those of us that think critically and seek truth. But then he would come out with another comment that would make you think, oh, he's still very much in the pocket of the system. Or he would do some kind of occult signaling that would let you know that he was clued in on major world events which were yet to come, which the rest of us didn't know about, but he did. So it becomes a really complex job trying to unravel these different sides to Prince. And because of that, he becomes one of the most fascinating artists to study. So that was what I put forward in part 2 of the show. And I think, and I suspect that I blew a few minds in there.
I certainly think you did as well. So I think you touched on it a little bit, but when did you start realizing that the music industry was corrupt?
This would have been around about 2007 is when the process started. And when I really threw myself into the research big time in 2010, it became obvious that every aspect of that industry is completely corrupt. And I make the point in my book, Musical Truth, Volume 1, which will be contentious to many, but it's my view that the music industry was created for the specific purpose of social engineering and mind control. That's what the controllers had in mind right from day one. So in my research, I go back about as far as the mid-1950s. I take 1955 as a starting point. That's when you had Bill Haley and the Comets with Rock Around the Clock. And this was a record which ushered in the rock and roll era. And then you had Elvis Presley coming through the following year. And that really was a game changer. That kind of music and those changing attitudes towards lifestyles among young people, including the creation of the word teenager, which wasn't even in popular use before the mid-1950s, signaled that everything that had gone before was now finished, and this was the start of a new era. And so it's my view that from the mid-1950s onwards, what we've seen through the music industry, coming out of America and coming out of Britain primarily, has involved the pushing of these agendas and the furthering of certain messages that the controllers wish to put forward. And it becomes clear that the controllers of organized society, those that pull off psyops and stunts and false flags and all these different agendas, are linked to those that control the entertainment industry. They're all working together. Otherwise, it wouldn't be possible for music and entertainment to push these messages. It's very clear that they're all involved in the same groups and networks, and they're all pushing towards the same goals.
Did you have any suspicions prior to 2007 that made you think that something was wrong within the music industry?
Not really. I was just kind of going with the flow up to that point. It's interesting because during all those years that I was a DJ, I was kind of skirting around the periphery of the music industry. I didn't really consider myself a cog in the machine. But I was very heavily invested in the music and in the clubs and the parties and, liaising with artists and record companies and such. And so I didn't really see that anything was wrong up to that point. And this is why I think so many people that work in the industry, they're definitely on the inside. They're part of the industry machine. Many of them have emailed me in recent years in response to my research, and they've said, oh, you've really opened my eyes to all this stuff, because I've worked in a record company for like 30 years and I never realized anything was wrong until it was pointed out to me. And so you can be so close to a job and industry that you don't see the wood for the trees. And you just go along because it's what you do. And it's not until somebody points out some occult symbolism or something that an artist has said or some strange anomaly or some aspect of their work that it becomes clear. So in recent years, I've looked back on some of the music that I used to play in the 90s when I first got started. And I was playing the hip hop music of those years. And at the time, I thought it was great. Clearly, the production values were highly superior to what we now have. But I never noticed messages being conveyed. And now I can. So clearly, with hip hop, there were violent messages that were being put forward in the lyrics. It was the pushing of criminal lifestyles that were talking about slinging crack, selling drugs, pimping hoes, this sort of thing. And at the time, it just completely went over my head. But looking back on it now, I can see how dangerous and destructive all that stuff was to young people that would have been lapping it all up. And I can't believe that I missed it. But when you go into the research, this stuff is undeniable.
So obviously the current music that we have, a lot of artists talk about their own trauma and how they coped with it. So they talk about subjects such as self-harm. They talk about anorexia and eating disorders in general. Do you think that sort of encourages isn't the right word, but sort of manipulates more children into having those coping mechanisms, whether they have trauma or not?
I would say it absolutely does. And artists engaging in that sort of behavior are probably doing it as a result of what they themselves have been through, have been subjected to as part of the industry machine, because the industry does abuse its own artists. We have trauma-based mind control, which is absolutely endemic throughout the entertainment industry. And in some cases, you may find that these artists are putting forward these messages at the behest of their controllers, of their handlers. They're being told to make these kind of statements because they want to have their young followers engaging in that kind of behavior, mimicking what they see their idols doing. So the industry has become very satanic and very dark. It's pushing a lot of symbolism that pertains to this. It's pushing a lot of really bad messages. And modern music now, I sound like my dad, but what the kids are listening to now, in my book, falls into two categories. So you've got really boring, bland, insipid songs that really just say nothing. They're instantly forgettable. So think of somebody like Ed Sheeran, who unbelievably has been put out there as the main artist of the past several years. But his songs, for me, are just so boring and bland that I'll be surprised if anyone's singing them in 5 years, never mind 50 years, like people still are the Beatles songs. And then when you get past the really bland, boring stuff, you have the really dangerous, destructive, toxic stuff. And so-called rap and hip hop and what that genre has now become definitely falls into that category. You've got these different spin-offs of so-called rap, which is nothing of the sort anymore, such as drill rap, pushing of violence and talking about gangs and rivalry. And then you've got trap music and you've got roadman, like grime music coming out of the UK. And this is just pushing violent messages and misogynistic messages and pushing agendas as well. Whatever the current social agenda is, then you can bet that this music is putting it out there. And this stuff is far more dangerous because it's satanic. It's very dark. You listen to the sound frequencies that are going into the productions and they don't make you feel good. They're not designed to make you feel good. The producers behind these sounds know what they're doing, and they're putting these young people in certain desired mind states through the so-called music. Music affects people more than they might think. Culture does generally. I've just given a talk this weekend at the Glastonbury Symposium. It was a bit different to what I normally talk about. This was mind control in James Bond movies, because I wanted to do something different from just talking about the music industry for a change. And they invited me to do a talk on this subject. And I made the point that I used to be a fan of the James Bond stories, both the books and the films, when I was a young lad. And I used to go into school on a Monday morning after watching a James Bond film on TV on a Sunday night. And I was starting to act like I was James Bond. I was trying to put down the school bullies in the same way that James Bond put down the villains. And I was trying to get with the girls in the same way that James Bond got with the girls. So these films were actually causing me to change my behavior. But I didn't realize it at the time. And it's only now, with the benefit of having done this nature of research for so many years, that I can see that films and music and popular culture do change people's behaviors if they're not aware of what's going on. If the conscious mind is not engaged and all this stuff is being soaked up by the subliminal mind, it can be literally directing the way people act. And that, of course, is the plan.
Thank you very much. I'm very conscious of time. So would you like to talk about your book, Musical Truth, Exposing the Mind Control Manipulation of Corporate Music Industry and How to Take Back Your Power?
Yep, well, that was the first book that I put out, which was published in early 2016. And that involved 5 years worth of research. So everything I'd come to discover about the true nature of the music industry and what it's used for went into that book. So it's 180,000 words. It's a bit of a doorstop. And it's got 20 chapters focusing on different aspects of the industry. So I take it all the way back to day one in the mid 1950s. I look at some of the unsavory elements of the music industry. We've got, unfortunately, aspects of pedophilia. We've got aspects of Satanism and dark occult ritual behavior. And that's been the case throughout the decades. We see that now. We saw it back in the 50s and 60s. Nothing's really changed, only the names of the artists pushing it. Then I go into mind control. I go into demonic possession, which is a very real thing, happy kind of subjects like that. The idea of ritual sacrifice. But I do end that book on a positive, uplifting note, because I go into spiritual areas and I talk about natural law, how those functions work, and how we collectively can change what we experience in this reality anytime enough of us want it. That's the good news. And the good news is that the occultists who control these industries recognize that dynamic, and they're using it for their ends and their goals. But we can harness all of that and turn everything around and use it towards our aims and our goals and what we want anytime we choose. So that's the message that I leave readers with. And then I put out volume 2 in early 2018. There were some different subject areas I got into there. I took a deep dive into the hip hop world, also electronic dance music, the acid house rave scene, asking some questions about that. Got into heavy metal, heavy rock. I got into the concepts of culture creation and lifetime actors. And then I completed the trilogy with volume 3, which came out just before Christmas 2021. That's still the current book. And I'm touring at the moment, presenting aspects of that. So as well as looking at the convid agenda and how certain artists and celebrities were used to further the aims of that particular scam, which is what it was, a massive scam, the biggest psyop ever played on humanity, I'm calling out various names from the music world that reinforced the messages. It's mainly sirs, you find. Sir Paul McCartney, Sir Elton John, Sir Mick Jagger, Sir Rod Stewart, Sir Lenny Henry, Sir Michael Caine, and the list goes on. But as well as that, I've also got a section in that book called Sound Bites, which is short stories that reinforce some of the points that were made in the previous books. And then as well as the trilogy, I've got a novel, an allegorical novel, which I put out at the end of 2019, and it was called The Cause and the Cure, which turned out to be quite a prescient title, given what happened just a couple of months afterwards. And that's a story which is set in the early 90s, 1990, 1991, in Oxford, which is where I grew up. And on the surface of it, it's like a murder mystery thriller in the sort of Inspector Morse vein, but there's so much more to it. It's layered. It's full of symbolism. It's full of allegory. It's full of little clues and anagrams. And the reader can have a lot of fun stripping away the layers and finding all that hidden meaning underneath. That's certainly the intention of that one. And the next book that I write, which I plan to put out in 2023, is going to be a sequel to the novel. So this one will be called The Gift. What is it? The Gift and the Curse. And it's going to be set in 2001 at the time of 9/11, featuring many of the same characters from the earlier book. So I'm looking forward to getting into that one. There's a lot you can get away with saying when you dress it up as fiction than you can if it's non-fiction.
Thank you very much. Is there any events that our viewers can go see you at in the upcoming future?
Well, there's loads, yeah. I'm keeping very busy. It's kind of like I used to do when I was a DJ. I would travel up and down the UK and all over the place. And I'm doing that now with my talks, presenting my information. So in the coming weeks, I've got, let's see, I'm DJing at an event in Battle, Sussex next weekend, 30th of July. Then I'm doing a talk in Scotland, one in Wales. I've got a conference in Nottingham. I've got a talk in Middlesbrough, another conference in Glastonbury in September. I'm doing another festival in Dorset near Dorchester. I've got another talk in Stroud, Gloucestershire. So the best place to catch up with all of these events is to go to djmarkdevlin.com/events, and they're all listed there.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I have to cut this interview short because of time, but I really appreciate your time, and I hope you have an amazing few weeks ahead of you.
No worries. Thanks. Great to connect with you. All the best.
You too. Thank you so much. Bye.
Cheers.
Well, thanks for coming. You could have been doing anything this afternoon. You could have been washing your car, mowing the lawn, shopping in Aldi, and instead you're here. So I'm sure this will be a more fulfilling and valuable use of your time. I can't promise you won't get pissed off, because that's one thing they say about the truth, isn't it? The truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off. And this is certainly true, I've found, when it comes to the music industry and various household name A-list artists who I now expose. It's my full-time job to do this. I never planned for this to be the case, I just kind of stumbled into it. But what I'm going to be presenting for you today is proof, evidence of the overriding notion behind the 3 musical truth books that I've now put out, based on what is now 12 years worth of research into the true nature of the corporate music industry and what it's really used for. And in terms of an overriding statement, I guess it could be summed up by saying the music industry is used as a control mechanism of the psychopathic, satanic, so-called elite ruling class that we have presiding over every aspect of our lives. So when it comes to entertainment, it's too good an opportunity for them to pass up in terms of what's available there by way of mind control and social engineering. And unfortunately, that is what entertainment is always used for. Even when you break down the etymology of the word, it means to enter into the mind and take hold of it. And this is as true of Hollywood movies and the television industry as it is of the music industry. But it's the music that I specialise in. And what I'm going to be presenting to you today is 3 examples of household name acts that you're all going to know, but where it can be shown that very far from them being grassroots organic acts that got to where they are as the result of just sheer hard work or crossing their fingers for good luck and a little bit of talent. In fact, they were placed there and they've been used to push various agendas of the so-called elite control system all along. So in part 1 of this talk, we're going to be looking at 2 of these acts. This will go on for an hour or so, and then we're going to take a refreshment comfort break of about 15-20 minutes, and then we'll come back for part 2, which will be another hour or so. So the first of the acts we're going to look at is arguably the most influential and popular music group of all time. That would be the Beatles. In my view, there's only one. Oh, we lost it. What's that there? I'll shout if I have to, but it's better this way.
Beatles.
Always something, trust me.
Sorry about this, guys.
According to a well-known Snoop Doggy Dogg lyric, which I'll clean up because there's children present, if it ain't one thing, it's a mother effing lover. Certainly seems to be the case with these events. There we go, we're a bit loud there, so how about that? That's a bit better, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. If anyone's videoing this, we'll edit that part out. So, yeah, as far as I'm concerned, there's only one other group that comes close to rivaling the Beatles in terms of influence and reach, and we'll be getting onto them shortly. So, how does a group become this influential in society? Is it possible to get there just off the back of hard work and good luck? Well, I would argue that it's not. You're chosen for these positions. There's always a vacancy there for the #1 pop group. the #1 rapper, the #1 R&B singer. And if it wasn't whoever's up there at the top of the tree, it'd be somebody else. You know, #1 rapper for God knows how many years would have been Jay-Z. But that's because he showed himself to be hungry enough for the fame and the fortune to be prepared to do anything for it. And if he hadn't been, they'd have just replaced him with somebody else. And so this is the dynamic we're looking at. And when it comes to the Beatles, there's much evidence to suggest that far from being just 4 young lads from Liverpool who wrote a few catchy songs, came up with a few good guitar riffs, crossed their fingers for good luck, did a bit of hustling, played a few gigs, and made it against all the odds, there will be other reasons why they became just that popular. This is a sleeve which we'll come back to in due course. It's certainly one you can analyse for days, but a good idea to start at the beginning in terms of how this group got its name in the first place. So this is the official cover story for why they were named the Beatles, and it comes from John Lennon. When writing an article for his friend Bill Harry's Merseybeat magazine in 1961, Lennon stated, "Many people ask, what are the Beatles? Why Beatles? How did the name arrive? So we'll tell you, it came in a vision. A man appeared on a flaming pie and said unto them, from this day on, you are the Beatles with an A. Thank you, Mr. Man," they said, thanking him, which is a deliberately ambiguous, typical Lennon kind of quip. What's interesting to me is when we get into the works of the notorious Victorian-era British occultist Aleister Crowley, who crops up in the backstory of the music industry more often than you'd believe. He's the original archetype of the sex and drugs and rock and roll lifestyle. We find this work, The Winged Beetle. What's very interesting is that in the title of this book, you have the names of 2 of the groups with which Paul McCartney was involved, Wings and the Beatles. Would that be a coincidence? Well, this is a scarab beetle, which was revered in ancient Egyptian cultures because it was thought to be symbolic, representative of the sun and the way it would roll across the sky from its rising point in the east to its setting point in the west. This particular beetle rolls its dung into a ball and pushes it across the land. And to the ancient Egyptians, this symbolised these movements of the sun. So it was very much revered within those cultures. Here it is within a stone carving. And the Beatles do seem to have had quite a bit of fascination with Egyptian mythology. Paul McCartney, or whoever it is, we'll get to that, put out an album in 2018 titled Egypt Station, where the imagery on the sleeve was absolutely replete with ancient Egyptian homages such as this. We then get 3 of these same scarab beetles in the coat of arms of George Martin, the so-called 5th Beatle. He was their famous producer, credited with crafting their sound, particularly in their latter period from 1966 through to the point where they split up, where they had all that grand orchestral production, and they become effectively a studio band after they stopped touring. So George Martin came from an aristocratic family, and his background wouldn't necessarily be the sort of one you would think of when it comes to the producer of a rock music act. But sometime in the 1990s, he had this coat of arms, this family heraldry commissioned, and you have 3 of these Beatles there. What's interesting is that there aren't 4, there are only 3. And true, at this point in the 90s, John Lennon had been assassinated, so that just left McCartney, George Harrison and Ringo, so that could be the reason. But I wonder if there might be another reason for it as well, again, which we'll get into as we progress. John Lennon himself, who started the group, grew up in a very interesting area of Liverpool. You have road names there like Druids Cross Road and Druidsville Road, which gives some hint to that area's past and some of the history that it was steeped in. And Lennon himself grew up on a road which was named Menlove Avenue, which is a name to conjure with. This is John Lennon's old man, Freddie Lennon. So he was a sailor, and he was often away at sea for vast periods, so the young John didn't really see much of his dad. But he was also a budding musician himself, and he put out a few records. This was one of them, titled That's My Life. I think this is from the early 60s. What's interesting about the sleeve design is that you've got this black and white checkerboard symbolism going on, which is straight out of Freemasonry. It symbolises the duality which is inherent in nature. For every value, there's an opposing value. So for night, there's day. For black, there's white. For up, there's down. For good, there's evil. And this is represented within this design, which you see on the floor of many a Masonic temple. So does this indicate that John Lennon's dad was a Mason, and was that membership then passed down the family line? I think that's quite plausible in the circumstances. The original lineup of the Beatles, after they morphed out of the Quarrymen, which was the original name, or one of the early names of the group, by the time they'd become the Beatles in about 1960, you had this lineup. I think this picture was from early 1962. So as well as John Lennon and Paul McCartney and George Harrison, who we know, you've got the original bassist, who was a young lad by the name of Stuart Sutcliffe. He held the role of bassist within the Beatles before McCartney took over the role. And the thing about Stuart Sutcliffe is that he didn't last very long. He was dead at the ripe old age of 21 of a brain aneurysm. In her book, his sister Pauline Sutcliffe tells of a story at the Beatles gig which erupted into violence and chaos, and where Stuart Sutcliffe found himself getting into trouble with various guys who wanted to beat him up. And John Lennon steamed in, and there was a big fight, big skirmish, and Sutcliffe apparently got kicked in the head, which his sister claims led to the onset of this aneurysm. But either way, he was gone just prior to the Beatles finding their fame. So their first hit song was Love Me Do in October of 1962. And by that point, Paul McCartney had stepped in to replace Stuart Sutcliffe. Also in this picture, you have the original drummer in the middle there, Pete Best, who's still alive. There's not many of them that are. He's 81, I think, now, and he's very silent. You won't catch him doing many interviews. He doesn't talk about these early days of the group. But there was an unfortunate situation where Pete Best's mother, Mona Best, was responsible for getting many of the early gigs of the Beatles. She owned a venue called the Casbah Club in Liverpool, and so she put on many of their early shows. Knocking around with the Beatles at the time were two lads of their sort of age who went on to become close affiliates and trusted members of their entourage. So there was Mel Evans, who was a bit of a roadie and a general assistant for the Beatles. We'll discover some more about him as we go on. And there was also a young lad by the name of Neil Aspinall, who was with the Beatles throughout their successful years. Well, Neil Aspinall ended up knocking up Pete Best's mum. Very embarrassing. And the result was a son named Rogue Best. But because the remaining Beatles wanted to keep Neil Aspinall on board, it was felt that it was a little embarrassing to have Pete Best, Mona's son, in the band. Another reason given for why Pete Best was kicked out, again, just prior to the Beatles becoming famous, just before their elevation to those higher levels, is that Pete Best was a good-looking young man back in the day, and apparently many of the Beatles' female fans were spending more time looking at Pete than at John and Paul, who the controllers of the Beatles wanted all the female attention to go to. So they kicked Pete out, replaced him with Ringo, problem solved.
He was thick as pig shit.
So this is Stuart Sutcliffe, and what we have going on here is some interesting hand signalling, which has come up so many times in my research. You get various methods of signalling which are employed by those in the club, those clued in to the agendas and these secret societies which actually control these institutions. So what he's doing here is making a pyramid sort of symbol with his hands. And this is known in occult circles as a triangle of manifestation. And it represents a trinity, a coming together of thoughts, emotions, actions, mind, body, and spirit. And when you bring those three elements into alignment with each other, And when you charge and imbue this symbol with your thoughts and your intents and your will, having achieved that, it's thought that you can bring what you're willing into physical manifestation. So this is something that only those clued into these mystery school teachings would be expected to have a knowledge of, and not some random 21-year-old lad out of Liverpool. You know, originally his family was from Scotland, as in Scottish Rite and Freemasonry, maybe a clue. But it's clear that Stuart knew a thing or two about a thing or two from this picture. And we have another one here from this photo shoot done by Astrid Kircher, a German photographer who was Stuart's girlfriend in the early 60s. And he's behind a gate here where you've got this interesting design where it appears to be 3 sixes. This is another method of occult signalling. You've got the 666 going on. It's a number that crops up endlessly in this research. Decade to decade, country to country, genre to genre, it's always there. And it gives another indicator as to why these groups become successful and what they're really all about, what they're really representing. A claim came from this guy, Dr. John Coleman, who was a former British military intelligence operative turned whistleblower. He put out this book in the early 90s titled Conspirators' Hierarchy, The Story of the Committee of 300. And within its pages, he makes the claim that the Beatles were actually the product of the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations in London. So this is a social engineering think tank which is concerned with the shaping and moulding of societal values. It trains the general public in how to think about certain things. It's their full-time job, they've been doing it forever. So Coleman makes the claim that the Beatles were used as part of the counterculture era in the 1960s to help embed so many of these societal changes that the so-called elites wanted to have going on. Unfortunately, he doesn't provide any citations or references for this. So we've just got to take him at his word. That's a major flaw in what he's presenting here. He also suggests that the Rolling Stones similarly came out of Tavistock and were used for similar purposes. From my research and from so many other things that I've seen, I would be inclined to think that Coleman was bang on the money here, and that suggestion is certainly plausible to me. It's just unfortunate that we don't have any specific documentation or witness testimonies or anything of that nature to prove it to be the case. But there's certainly many things to suggest very strongly that this was the case. So we mentioned George Martin, the 5th Beatle, their famous producer. And before he started working at EMI Studios and got assigned to be the Beatles' in-house producer, pretty much from the start of their career, he cut his teeth in audio production at the BBC Radiophonic Workshop. Here he is, working there. And this was the aspect of the BBC that was responsible for experimentation with sound, with sonics, seeing what could be achieved. They pulled out that very distinctive Doctor Who original theme, with an oscillator and all kinds of sound production techniques going on. So he was experimenting with what could be achieved by manipulating sound long before he got assigned to that role with the Beatles. And as I mentioned, in the second incarnation of their career, there was a lot of that sort of experimentation going on their albums. And there really were 2 very distinct periods for the Beatles. So when they were first presented to the world, from late 1962, they were effectively a boy band. They'd been put together for the purpose. And they were singing very simplistic boy meets girl love songs. She loves you, I want to hold your hand, from me to you, this kind of thing. But in 1966, a change was starting to occur. You had the record Tomorrow Never Knows, which was based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead, as translated by Timothy Leary, the so-called acid guru, very prominent within the 60s counterculture flower power scene. And this began a fascination with Eastern mysticism, which crept into many of their other tracks. By the time the following year had come around, 1967, the so-called Summer of Love, they'd released the album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Deeply psychedelic, very experimental, followed up by Magical Mystery Tour. And it was pretty clear by that point that the Beatles were playing their part in sowing all these societal changes, which, as I suggested, would have come straight out of agencies such as Tavistock. Over in California, you had the flower power hippie scene, and you had all these groups that were pushing psychedelic rock music in conjunction with never-ending supplies of LSD and other mind-altering substances which were getting put into the market. And there's so much documentation to prove that the vast bulk of the LSD around in California in those times was coming directly out of those nice people at the CIA, you know, whose job it is to keep us all safe and, you know, take care of us. Quite similar to British military intelligence, really. And then over in London, you had the British take on that counterculture scene. And the Beatles were very much at the forefront of that. So the same changes were getting put into society. Different attitudes towards sex, towards family dynamics, towards drugs, towards society generally. Civil rights movements and causes and all this kind of thing. And all of this was being very closely guided and steered in certain desired directions by aspects of military intelligence working in conjunction with social engineering think tanks. And it's my view that the Beatles played a very strong role in this. They also would appear to have been doing a fair bit of occult signalling during these times. So here we have their debut album with the Beatles, and in this photo shoot we see half of their faces are concealed in shadow, so that you've only got one eye showing. So there's different ideas being conveyed here. It's the Beatles embracing their shadow selves, doing that shadow work on their base consciousness, in contrast to higher aspects of their consciousness. That's the side that they're embracing. We've also got the one-eye symbolism, and that pertains to the so-called all-seeing eye, the third eye, the pineal gland, this portal to higher aspects of consciousness. So again, the question that could be raised here is, could 4 young lads from Liverpool who just happened to put a group together and just happened to become famous against all the odds be expected to know about all this stuff, or were they being clued in on it by way of the circles in which they moved? Here we've got an interesting image from the Beatles 65 album. They're under umbrellas. Umbrellas have been identified as a trigger in mind control programming, which we find again throughout the entertainment industry wherever we look. It's always there. Also, it's an interesting word when you break down the etymology of it. According to this definition, from the late 16th century, it connotes a phantom or a ghost, from the Latin, meaning literally shade. In 1965, the Beatles put out this album, Help, which was the soundtrack to their movie of the same name. And what appears to be getting conveyed here is you appear to have the 4 lads spelling out the letters of help, H-E-L-P, in semaphore, this method of signalling using various bodily poses. But when you look into it some more, you realise that's not what's going on here. This doesn't spell help in semaphore. What it's actually a representation of is what is known as grade signs. And these come out of the teachings of the Ordo Templi Orientis, the OTO, which is one of these secret society mystery school fraternities once helmed by the aforementioned Aleister Crowley. It's one of so many links between the Beatles and Crowley. So we've got some examples of grade signs down at the bottom here, and we've got the Beatles striking some of these very similar poses on the sleeve to Help. And nobody at the time that wasn't a part of those groups could be expected to make sense of what was going on there. Here we've got the Beatles hanging out with Jimmy Savile. Well, why wouldn't they? You know? I mean, Savile was all over the place in the 1960s, and if you were a popular music act, you would have been rubbing shoulders with him at some point or other. But Savile's association with the Beatles seems to go a bit further, given that he actually went on the road with them in 1964 for a whole bunch of their live talks, and he compared and opened up their shows for them, travelled around the country. Can you imagine anything worse than being on tour with Jimmy Savile? Apart from spending every Christmas with him for 12 years, as Margaret Thatcher is said to have done. And here we've got Savile in his black and white mind control trigger coat. So what could possibly go wrong? And it does seem to me that there's much evidence to suggest that the Beatles themselves were subject to mind control programming. It turns out most major assets of the music industry are. That will be a shocking statement for many people, but there is much evidence to show this to be the case. I've got endless citations and references to this effect in my first Musical Truth book. And certainly when you become as successful and as influential as the Beatles, those that control these industries would not leave it to chance which groups become their major assets. They would want to be in control of every single aspect of them. They'd want to make sure they don't go off script, they don't become loose cannons, and they continue to push whatever agendas have been set out for them. So here we've got Savile and the Beatles pretending to be asleep, or could it be hypnotised, possibly? This is the first of some very interesting poses where we've got Lennon and McCartney, not the others, but Paul and John, with their hands hidden inside their coats. And this is a symbol or a signal which pertains to the so-called hidden hand. Again, it comes out of Freemasonry, and it conveys this idea of there being hidden forces behind every aspect of human lives, actually, not just music, but everything else. So throughout history, we've got pictures or paintings, portraits of famous figures putting their hand inside their coat in this way, which is denoting their membership of certain secret society fraternities. And that certainly seems to be the case with Paul and John. Here we've got McCartney doing it again, and you never see George Harrison and Ringo Starr doing that. Interesting image of John Lennon covering one eye. This is the one eye symbolism, once again. No shortage of this. And 4 separate shots of McCartney, or whoever it may be, we'll get there, don't worry, in interviews in different decades, just happening to cover one of his eyes in exactly the same way. So would this be a spontaneous habit that he's doing subconsciously, doesn't realise what's going on? Or is it more likely that it's some sort of method of signalling going on here? Or could it be a product of some sort of programming? Just before we move on from this picture, I would ask you to consider whether the individual in the top right square can possibly be the same individual as in the top left square. I'll leave you to ponder that one.
Definitely not.
More signalling going on the yellow submarine sleeve from 1968. You've got McCartney giving it the 666 sign. Somebody will take a still of me doing that and post it online and say, I told you he was a Satanist. And then you've got Lennon doing the Baphomet horn hand sign, and there's different versions of this picture. Sometimes he's got the palm facing inwards, and sometimes it's facing outwards. But this is symbolising Baphomet. That's one interpretation of it, this androgynous entity so beloved of Freemasonry and different occult secret societies. And it's the idea of the horned hand. It's initiation within these secret society groupings, once again. It's signalling for those in the know. And back in 1968, most people would have had no clue what's being communicated here. Only those that have been schooled in these teachings would be able to comprehend it. But it's a different matter now. It's 2022, and we can know what's being conveyed in pictures such as this. The cat is out of the bag, and it's not going back anytime soon. Another interesting picture here, could this be the key to it? We've got Paul and John giving it a Masonic handshake. Any Freemasons in the house today? No? Where's the MI5 agents? Yeah, got a couple there, okay. A couple more outside, I think. There's always some.
Undeclared shadow fighter.
Okay. Well, I've never been a Freemason myself, despite what you may hear. So I don't know for sure that that's a Masonic handshake, but those in the know tell me it is. And so we could be onto something here. Could this be why the Beatles, in particular, became so successful, were chosen to be that group? Could this be why Lennon and McCartney, as a songwriting team, have been put up there on a pedestal over and above any other songwriters of the modern era? But another question which then arises is, did Paul and John actually write all the songs that have been credited to them? And if you want to know more about that one, I would say to have written all the songs that were credited to them during that period. And as far as I'm concerned, that is proof that they had many of their songs gifted to them by other songwriters, and they merely put their names to it. It's an aspect of social engineering. It is, of course, trickery and deception, but those that control these industries do this stuff all the time because they are dark occultists and they do adhere to these different secret society mystery schools. So I mentioned to you about how certain artists undergo mind control programming because the intention is to keep them on script at all times. What they don't want is artists speaking out, gaining a voice of their own, saying what's really on their mind, and making statements which it doesn't serve the system for them to be making. And I personally feel that John Lennon fulfilled that criteria for a time. I personally feel that he did become something of a genuine political activist, or sought to, and tried to put out a few genuine, sincere messages. My personal feeling is that he started to develop a guilty conscience about what it was he'd been a part of during his time with the Beatles. So when he started his solo...
I just got off to sleep after about an hour. Tried to phone up and he just said, Brian died. I can't believe it. Yeah, Nick flew to Australia to do Ned Kelly. Keith was working in the studio. Me and each other went to a funeral. When we drove through Cheltenham, all the streets were packed with people. I've never seen anything like it. It was like a coronation or something.
The prime suspect for Brian's murder, that's got louder, hasn't it? How's that? That's a bit better. The prime suspect was always this individual, a guy by the name of Frank Thorogood. And he was a builder by trade, but he was also employed as a bodyguard for the Rolling Stones, so that went well. And he'd been hired by Brian to do some restoration work on his cottage, so he was working there at the time that Brian died. More on Frank Thorogood. He himself died in 1993, but the story did not die with him. In 2013, Thorogood's daughter Jan Bell spoke to the UK's Daily Mail, must be true then, to claim that her father had told her of a vicious row between Jones and other members of the Stones on the day of his death. She related this story as part of her report to Sussex Police, she said, but the police had decided to take no action on it. What a surprise. Thorogood's claim was that Mick Jagger and Keith Richards had visited the farmhouse to ask Jones to agree to a financial settlement for giving over the name of the Rolling Stones. A row reportedly broke out when Jones refused. According to Thorogood, Richards then drew a knife on Jones in anger. Thorogood is said to have calmed everyone down, after which Jagger and Richards left the property. Brian turns up dead later that night. And it seems the group recovered from the tragedy of the loss of their founder very quickly because by the following weekend, the Rolling Stones were performing their famous free concert in London's Hyde Park, and Brian's replacement had already been unveiled. Well, 1969 was a very unfortunate year for the Rolling Stones because if we fast forward to the 6th of December that year, we have their notorious performance at Altamont, a racetrack in Southern California, as part of a concert event going on. And what happened that day was captured in this documentary, Gimme Shelter. And the thing that it's most remembered for is that there were 4 deaths that day of attendees of the concert. There was a young couple that died in a drowning accident close to the site. Another one died of apparently an overdose, but the most famous death, or infamous death, was of this lad by the name of Meredith Hunter, 18 years of age. He was a member of the audience, and he was stabbed to death by the Hells Angels, who'd been hired to do the security at the concert that day. So what could possibly go wrong? And we've got some original footage here from that event and of this moment.
if those cats, we're splitting, man, if those cats don't stop beating everybody up inside. I want them out of the way, man. I don't like you.
Hey people, come on, let's be cool. People, please, there's no reason to hassle anybody. Please don't commit it.
So this event is reminiscent of other rock concerts which have descended into chaos when members of the audience have died. So there was a Who concert in Cincinnati where members of the audience died in a skirmish. There was Pearl Jam performing at the Roskilde Festival in Denmark, and members of the audience died there. And just last year there was the Astroworld event, very bizarre concert in Houston, Texas, where Travis Scott was the headline act, and various members of the crowd died there. It's very difficult to get a handle on what exactly happened, because in some accounts it was drug overdoses, others claim it was adverse reactions to vaccines, others claim it was a push and a crush in the crowd. But what we had here was definitely a stabbing, and it's led many who study these subjects to suspect that this formed a kind of ritual sacrifice on the part of the group. And I certainly believe this sort of thing does go on because of the true nature of those that control these industries. They are at their core dark occultists who adhere to certain rituals. So according to Grace Slick of the group Jefferson Airplane, who were also performing at Altamont, she picked up on the strange vibrations that day, recalling that the vibes were bad. Something was very peculiar, not particularly bad, just real peculiar. I'd expected the loving vibes of Woodstock, but that wasn't coming at me. This was a whole different thing. Well, that event was captured on film by a budding young filmmaker of the time. His name was George Lucas. He won't come to anything. You probably never heard of him. So this leads to suspicions that this event may have formed some sort of initiation process into the upper ranks of the industry on the part of George Lucas, and that he was present that day not as any kind of accident. So we're fast forwarding now from 1969 to 2014. Nothing interesting happened in between, like, you know. And we have the death, sudden, unexpected, shocking, of Mick Jagger's girlfriend, a fashion designer by the name of Lorraine Scott. She turned up dead, we're told, as the result of committing suicide. And she's said to have hung herself with a red silk scarf. This was in the midst of a slew of deaths within the high-level fashion industry, which were occurring in the same way. People were turning up dead, we're told, having hung themselves with red silk scarves. There was the designer Alexander McQueen, Kate Spade, and various others from the fashion world, all around this time. So there could well be some kind of ritualistic sacrificial aspect to this, particularly considering friends and family of Lorraine Scott said that she seemed cheerful, she was making plans for the future, she was due to hold a dinner party the very next day, and she was not giving off the vibes of someone that was tired of living. And as I mentioned, a lifetime actor's work is never done, and once they've got you for the entirety of your career. Jeffrey Epstein had 301 Britons in his little black book, including Mick Jagger, Tony Blair, no great surprise, Richard Branson, Sir Richard Branson, Sir Mick Jagger. Something about these sirs, you know. And more recently, like McCartney, Mick Jagger hits out at anti-vaxxers. You can't argue with these people, he says. Of course he does, because he's been told to say it by those that facilitated his career, because that's the way it works with these groups. None of them get there under their own steam. None of them get there as a result of any kind of random chance or accident. They're all placed there, they're all created, and when you're talking about this level of the game, there are no exceptions. In part two, we're going to look at a third music act, many fascinating elements of them. We're going to look at evidence that this act, like the two we've looked at, also had their career facilitated for them. But we're going to go into some more interesting realms as well, including aspects of how we're told they passed away. So let's take a little break now of 15-20 minutes, and then we'll come back for part two. I've got copies of all my books, by the way, over at the table there, and I'll be sitting there and happy to have a chat with anyone during the break. See you soon.